Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. Since becoming a member of the Senedd for the Neath constituency in 2016, Jeremy Miles has held some of the most significant roles in Welsh Government, including Counsel General, Minister for European Transition, and currently Minister for Education and Welsh Language, in a difficult time for the sector post-pandemic. We are delighted today to be joined by Jeremy Miles. Hello, Jeremy.
Hi.
Thank you for being here. So as we said, most of our listeners will know you from your time in Welsh Government, but I wondered if you could give us sort of a quick overview of your background in Pontarddulais and through to university and your sort of initial decision to enter politics.
Yeah, well, I think in a way, being education minister, education really is sort of the thread that runs throughout my life, the golden thread, really, I think of it in many ways. So as you say, I was born and raised in Pontarddulais in a Welsh-speaking home. I went to school in the village, Welsh medium primary, and my parents were both very supportive of my schooling. I think probably, I hope they wouldn't mind me saying this, they probably, hadn't made the most of the opportunity themselves and were really keen and supportive of both me and my sister in all we did at school. And, I was the kind of kid who read every book in the library at school and played musical instruments and those sorts of things. So I really relished my time in school. I went to Ysgol Government for my secondary school, for my comprehensive school. I think I'm right in saying that makes me the first education minister to have all of my education through the Welsh medium sector, which, since I'm also Welsh language minister, I think, has a sort of useful insight as a result of that. I guess politics surrounded us as I was growing up anyway. My grandfathers on both sides were local councillors, but it probably wasn't until I got to comprehensive that I, became politically aware myself, really. And part of that, as with a lot of people my age, was a little bit about the experience of the miners' strike, not in my own community, but certainly in the communities which sent children to Ysgol, and also very formative in my political worldview, if you like, was the fact that I was, the fact that I'm gay. And I think growing up as a gay teenager, and I've spoken about this before, not having a sense of that being reflected back at you in society at all, obviously, but in particular at that time in school, has really shaped some of my political views in later life, if you think about the importance of people feeling included and feeling, that they're not on the outside, if you like. So I think that was when I became probably first politically aware. Then I went to Oxford University, to New College, studied law there. And I think probably it's true to say that I didn't really have any idea of how much disparity in wealth there is in the UK until I had that experience, which was really quite eye-opening for me, really. So that was my education. I became a lawyer. I taught law for a year, actually, university in Warsaw. So that's been my only experience of teaching. And whilst I enjoyed it, I didn't think I was very good at it. I'm full of admiration for those who pursue a career in teaching at any level, really, because I know that I wasn't cut out for that myself. So I practiced law for a long time and was a partner at a law firm in London. Then I worked for media businesses after that, so ITV and NBC, the US TV network. And then I moved back to Wales. And the reason I did that was I'd been politically active throughout that period. And I was volunteering as a mentor for kids in East London where I lived, and kids from disadvantaged backgrounds who needed some guidance, if you like, about how to take forward their studies or their own kind of careers and aspirations. And it was pretty clear to me that they didn't have the same opportunities that I felt I had growing up in Wales in the 70s and 80s. And I decided, that was a sort of moment of awakening, really, that I wanted to play my part in giving something back, if you like. So that was the motivation for going into politics.
Had it always been Labour for you, Jeremy? I know you mentioned you had two family members who were councillors. Were they Labour councillors? Has it always been something you were sort of brought up into? Or is it something you sort of found later in life, the Labour movement?
Yeah, no, they were both Labour councillors. And so in my village when I was growing up, I don't think I thought of anybody as being anything other than Labour, really, apart from some people who used to go to chapel who I knew to be Plaid Cymru, and I didn't really, have a very clear sense as a kid of what that meant, really. But I suppose one of my political heroes is Jim Griffiths, who I felt, found there to be no tension at all between a commitment to the Welsh language and Welsh language culture on the one hand, and a profound commitment to the Labour Party on the other. And I think in many ways, that's also shaped my politics as well.
I'm sure we'll get back onto that, but I did want to talk about one thing, which was the sadness we had when we discovered that the website Miles for Beaconsfield is no longer active. Would you tell us a little bit about what you learned about politics and yourself for standing in an election in a safe Conservative seat? And it must be a bit different standing there than in South Wales.
Yeah, well, I think if you're thinking of a vocation in politics, it's useful to have a go at standing in a seat where you clearly have no prospect of winning. But the reason it's important is because it does test whether you feel that you're cut out for it, really. And if you're standing somewhere like that, I was living in London. That was just before I moved back to Wales. The Labour Party has never been in power in Beaconsfield. So my hats off to people who managed to keep the flame alive in the leafy kind of home counties of England for the Labour Party. And it does teach you a little bit of political resilience. And also, when people ask you, why you want to do it, it helps you shape your thinking about that. So whilst I had never any prospect of winning, I'm probably sure that was one of the motivations for doing it, actually, at that point.
Do you think it also helps you just sort of understand a little bit about what the other side think and about how to sort of tailor your thoughts about trying to appeal to the broadest range of people?
I think it probably does. I don't think there was any prospect of appealing to a particularly broad range of people in Beaconsfield in 2010. But it's always good, I think, in politics to subject yourself to challenge from people who don't have the same worldview as you, even though you're never going to agree. That constant challenge is good in terms of testing your own thinking on things. And I still think that's helpful. When you're having a debate in the Senedd, for example, often that can be about political positioning, which is necessary but not especially illuminating. But sometimes people will make a point which, whilst you might not admit it in the chamber, does make you go away and think, have I got that quite right? And that's a very positive thing, I think.
So it's not a massive secret. You did try and win the selection in Aberavon in 2015, very narrowly losing out to Stephen Kinnock. But what made you choose the Senedd rather than pursuing another Westminster constituency? I
think the reason I tried to seek this election for Parliament was because when I lived in London, I had just more experience of being in and out of the House of Commons for various things. And so I probably had more familiarity, if I'm honest, with the workings of Parliament. But ultimately, I started off by telling you that education was one of my kind of drivers in politics, really. And then you start to think, where is it that I can make the most impact in relation to the things I care most about? And for me, that was then the Senedd. And so I had an opportunity when Gwenda Thomas stood down, there was a vacancy, and I'm now representing Meath.
What was your first impressions of the Senedd when you were elected? How would you compare it to the UK Parliament?
Well, it's very different, isn't it? So the culture is very different. And I think, if I'm completely honest, it took me a moment to adjust to what I felt was a different way of doing politics and being political. So, the electoral system is one thing, but the political culture around the Senedd is also obviously very different from the culture in Parliament. I mean, I've got no great insight into the culture in Parliament, I hasten to add, but it's pretty obviously the case. But I think it doesn't take very long to recognise that we have a political system in Wales in democratic devolution, which encourages collaborative working when that's possible, in fact needs it in many, many ways. But, that's not at the cost of, as I say, that political debate. And I think in many ways I'm more suited to the political culture of the Senedd than I would have been to Parliament, actually. Sort
of a month of being elected, you sort of were exposed and engaged in one of the most interesting or, well, interesting, toxic, whatever choice words you may have, political debates in British history, which was the Brexit referendum, and how that, we all know how that sort of overshadowed the last 6 years or so. How would you reflect on that process sort of 6 years later? And what did you really learn about the UK, Wales, your own constituency of Neath during that process up until now?
So it's a very salutary lesson, I think, in political terms, that the vocation that you choose is unpredictable. I would never have chosen the first significant political development after being elected to the Senedd was the vote to leave the European Union, because it's obviously coloured everything since, and will do for a very long time again. And I remember feeling that morning when the results came through, very disorientated, if you like, because it's hard to predict these things, isn't it? But I felt that I was out of touch, if I'm completely honest, not having predicted the outcome. I felt that the fact that Wales had also voted to leave the European Union was particularly, obviously disappointing to me, but I was, particularly surprised that I hadn't understood that correctly. But, and then after that, most politicians will tell you, you have two sets of political discussions going on. One is the kind of thing that you see in the Senedd, which is the political debate, and it was pretty ferocious for quite a long time, obviously in some ways even more so in Parliament. But you're also having discussions with your constituents and others about what had led people to vote for leaving. And I think there's lessons for us all to learn from those sorts of discussions as well. I then obviously became Brexit minister, and I feel, at least I saw firsthand there, a UK government, a Conservative government, operating a vision for the UK and for politics, which I found, pretty repulsive, to be honest, and, very often riding roughshod over any other political opinion, however well-intentioned, well-argued, well-supported, actually. And it was my sort of first practical glimpse to that sort of, bullying unionism, I would call it, really, which was sort of turbocharged then under Boris Johnson, and which is, very bad news for the UK, very bad news for Wales, certainly. And I think the experience of Brexit is a litany of broken promises, isn't it, really? A campaign which was profoundly misleading on the part of those making the pledges about what would happen if we left, and all those promises have been broken. And I think it kind of culminated, really, for me at least, in the Internal Market Act, which was a deliberately provocative act, I think, and obviously took the UK government to court around that. Clearly, that didn't succeed in the end. But I think that is a very bad prospectus for the future of the UK if that's how Conservative governments in Westminster are going to continue to behave.
What do you think the process has done to our politics and to people's trust in politicians, whether that be the whole process around, politicians voting eventually to leave the EU, or whether that is just what they were told during the referendum process?
Well, I think where we are at the moment is, clearly, as I said, promises were made which have not been kept. What I think has happened, though, in the period since Brexit, obviously, COVID has dominated every aspect of life, hasn't it? And has completely transformed our lives in the last 2 and a bit years, and has obviously, I think, disguised some of the impacts of Brexit, but they're becoming a lot clearer now. And what we can't have is a situation where just saying Brexit closes down political debate. So we need to find a way of having an honest discussion about some of this. We can already see some of the loudest advocates of Brexit in the press now saying actually aspects of it have been very damaging. So there's the beginning there of a kind of more honest discussion. But for those of us like myself who argue that we should stay in the European Union, we need to understand as well that simply saying that isn't going to be persuasive enough. We need to show people why we were right, and I think that's a big task.
I was going to ask, the obviously not asking you to comment necessarily on how the UK Labour Party operates, but do you think it is incumbent upon all politicians really to highlight these problems? And do you think that sometimes there's a tendency to think that they're still relitigating old elections rather than fighting new ones?
Well, where we are today is that we are still in the territory where framing things in the context of Brexit still has everyone reaching for the flags that they were flying at the time. And that's probably true on both sides of the debate, if I was being totally honest. That's not a very good way of conducting public discussion about things. But equally, it's not something you can change overnight, given how passionate, if you're looking at it positively, but how strongly expressed views on both sides were and how tribal the debate became. But over time, I think it will become easier to have that public debate and discussion about it. But by the way, that isn't to say that we should not be making the argument now. We absolutely should, but we just need to make it in ways which probably don't provoke the same tribal passions as the debate itself did.
You entered government fairly quickly after becoming an MS. What did you learn from your role as Councillor General and, working with, then First Minister Carwyn Jones? Do you want to go through a bit of the process about being asked to enter government and your experience from that?
Yes. So I was surprised to be asked to join the government so early. I'm pleased, obviously, as well. And the role of Councillor General is, it's a broad-ranging role. It's not a ministerial post in the sense of having a department, but you have a wide-ranging brief in that you are dealing with all the legal aspects, all the devolution aspects across every part of the government. And this was happening at the time, obviously in the context of, leaving the European Union. So there was a particularly controversial, I suppose, period. It's a fascinating role because, whilst on the one hand, it's about providing advice, I defined the role as being, obviously, you need to make sure the government is acting within its powers. That's pretty fundamental, core part of the role, obviously. But I also felt that the government, should be acting to the fullest extent of its powers. And so, that is an important way in which devolution works, really, to have that ambitious, expansive view of the powers of the Senedd and the government.
One of the major discussions that's been going on in the last few years in the legal sector is the idea of a Welsh legal jurisdiction. So talking about that, but also the prospect of additional powers elsewhere, how likely do you see that being in the next few years or so?
Well, I think the case for a separate jurisdiction was made very coherently, very, I think, persuasively by the Thomas Commission in its report on the justice system, the devolution of justice. So anyone who's particularly interested in it will, be able to look at that to see what it means in practical terms. It's, in most countries, it's a pretty uncontroversial thing. So, each of the states of the US have their own state jurisdiction, for example. So I think it's important to see it in that broader context. I think it will not be delivered by a Conservative government. I hope it will be delivered by a UK Labour government, and I think that would be the right thing to do. And I think I would like to see it happen.
Are there areas of policy that you would like to see devolved, or even perhaps in your context as education minister, are there any areas that would make your life easier if it were devolved?
Well, actually, education is, almost entirely devolved. The challenge that we have in education isn't so much the devolution of the powers. It's the fact that, for example, with higher education, that we have the powers, but the mechanisms for delivering some of those powers are, UK-wide or England and Wales-wide quite often. So student finance is a good example of that. That's basically run by HMRC and by the Student Loan Company. And although we have a relationship with the two, obviously they're not devolved. So there's a limit in practical terms of what you can do. So I think, the challenge in education is getting to a place where those discussions can happen on a UK-wide basis in a more, in a way which better reflects the fact that there's more than one administration in the UK being affected by the decisions, really. We aren't there at all yet. But it's more about that, really, than the devolution of extra powers in education, certainly.
Whilst we're on education, it's, one of the biggest briefs in government, and it's been made much more challenging by the effects of the pandemic on education and attainment in Wales. But what would you say are the key challenges you're currently facing, and How would you characterise the overall health of the education sector?
Well, I mean, you've hit the nail on the head in one of the points that you made there. So, from my ambition for the education sector in Wales is to reflect the principle that every child deserves excellence. And I think what we have seen during COVID in schools, as in other parts of society, is that those children, young people who perhaps don't have as much support as others at home will have had a particularly challenging time. So this year I've done a couple of policy statements, really. So one was a statement of the Senedd, the one was a speech I gave to the Bevan Foundation, which talks about a system-wide approach to making sure there are high standards and high aspirations as well for all our kids. And that's really starting from the early years, but right through then to vocational education, higher education and beyond. And this idea as well that Wales should be a nation of second chances where it's never too late to learn. So recognising that not everyone, for whatever reason, not everyone has the best opportunity in school. It's really important that we can help people re-engage with their education at any point in life. But I think the effect of COVID is very significant. Obviously, the COVID funding which was available is no longer being provided, but I've ring-fenced money in our budget for the next couple of years to make sure that the work we've been doing in schools, supporting teachers with that sort of bespoke support they can give to children and young people, can continue. And I think every part of the education system recognises just how fundamental, the idea of the well-being of learners and staff as well, but the well-being of learners is for education recovery. Obviously, it's always been important, but I think there's a very much more renewed commitment and focus on that across the system. And you can see some of that in how we've responded as a government in terms of increasing the funding available to mental health provision in schools, the whole school approach to well-being, those things which make sure that young people come to school able to learn. At the end of the day, that's the starting point, isn't it? If you've got young people coming to school not feeling settled, not feeling motivated, not feeling confident, not feeling connected, that young person is never going to be able to take full advantage of their education. And we've got to make sure that they're not in that position, obviously.
You must be, of course, concerned, though, about the nature of finances at the moment, looking at the way inflation is fighting against government budgets and in terms of what you can do in order to improve the situation.
Yes, I mean, it's a big concern for education, as it is for some of the other spending departments. So you will have heard us talk about the Welsh Government's budget being worth £4 billion less over this 3-year period. That's inflation. That's before any cuts which the UK government might announce in their budget or autumn statement in a couple of weeks' time. And if the UK government don't change course, then cuts to services are inevitable, and they are horrendous decisions, which we as ministers are having to look at. That's why it's so important that the UK government changes course. You'll have heard people like Andrew Morgan and other council leaders talking about the pressures which Welsh local government is under as well as a consequence of this. It's of a scale that we haven't seen before, even during the George Osborne years. It's pretty unimaginable if the UK government continue on this course.
With that in mind, how are schools, colleges and universities set to respond to this post-pandemic landscape?
Well, it's going to be incredibly difficult. We are in a continuous discussion, really, with local education authorities, with teaching unions, to understand what this looks like on the ground in schools. Because of the way we've continued to fund schools during the period of COVID, the level of school reserves at the moment is quite significantly higher than it's ever been before. So schools and local authorities are looking at how they can use some of those funds to help some of the current pressures. But obviously, once those funds are spent, they're spent. It's not a sustainable long-term way of addressing the cost pressures. But we had a discussion a few weeks ago with local authorities and teaching unions, and we were all pretty ashen at the end of the call, really discussing the implications for schools and colleges. So, that's why it's so important that we get the UK government to recognise the scale of the challenge.
You are also engaging in quite a lot of wide-ranging reforms and innovations, such as potentially expanding the school day and proposing ideas to remodel the term calendar. What has been your driving force in proposing or considering these reforms? Are you just exploring options, or do you have an overarching plan to try and reform the school system?
Well, on the school day, so we ran some trials for 10 weeks in a number of schools to test some ways of extending the school day. And the reason for doing that is to give young people an opportunity to experience other, extracurricular activities outside the school. So some of that was around, art and music. Some of it was around additional sports. Some of it is around chess and gaming. So there's a range of different activities. And so we're working through at the moment, evaluating what we've learned from that set of trials. What's been clearly the case is that young people have found it a good way to re-engage with school after a very difficult time. So we're looking at the moment at what we can do into the future with that. Obviously, we'll talk to our social partners before we make any decisions on that. On the school year, so the driver for that is twofold, really. One, the long summer holiday, the effect that has in terms of learning loss on young people, including perhaps some of the most disadvantaged young people. That's the first aspect of it. And then hearing from teachers saying that the autumn term, which we're in now, can be pretty punishing because it's so long. So obviously, we're not the first government to look at reforming the school year. It's happened in local authority areas in England, for example, and it's happened in other parts of the world. So we are drawing on all of that experience. What we've done is over the last few months, done a piece of broad research to see how people felt about the school year generally. And we've had some interesting responses to that. Most people felt there was a case for change. People couldn't agree on what the kind of change would be, which I suppose in a way is a metaphor for politics generally, really. But the key thing is we will be consulting on this, and we'll do that later in this academic year. But we're working with education authorities and teaching unions at the moment about what that could look like. But there'll be, the key thing is there'll be plenty of opportunity to hear from parents, young people, teachers, but also business sectors that might be affected. So tourism, childcare sectors as well. So there's a range of people who would be affected by any change. So we want to make sure there's a big discussion around it.
One of the other major changes, of course, is the new curriculum. Some may argue that in this great period of flux, now would be the worst time to implement a new curriculum. But what would your response be to that?
Well, I think that I obviously think it's the right time to do it. And the reason is this: there was a judgment to be taken in the heat of the COVID experience about whether now was the right time to continue with the plan to roll out the curriculum, or whether there was a case for delaying it. And in the end, I was absolutely persuaded by two things, really. Speaking to primary schools, generally speaking, primary schools have had further to travel on the new curriculum journey, if you like, because of the way we teach young people in primary schools. And whilst obviously people had anxieties about going from COVID into the new curriculum, generally speaking, primary schools felt broadly ready to do that. And I also felt that the COVID time was one when learner well-being, focus on flexibility, looking at different ways to teach was the way that we were able to make sure young people continue to be educated during that period. And I felt that focus on the learner, that focus on well-being, that flexibility, that creativity, that innovation that we saw teachers and teaching assistants doing amazingly, really. That's what the new curriculum requires. So it felt to me like that was its own preparation, really, for the curriculum. And obviously, I gave secondary schools the option of starting this year or delaying for a year to start next year. And broadly, half of them decided to go this year and half of them decided to go next year. So I think that tells you there's a reasonable level of confidence in the system.
Do you have any concerns about the resources that teachers are using and the potential maybe for teachers to default to tried and tested sources rather than embracing some of the potential benefits of the new curriculum?
Well, I think that is always a risk, and there's a culture change, isn't there, when you bring in a new curriculum. So it's more than, in a sense, it's more than the way you're teaching. It's we are saying to teachers, we trust you to deliver this curriculum and to tailor the curriculum, to design the curriculum in your school in a way which reflects the individual community in which the school is, but also the needs of the range of pupils in your classes. And I think that's the really exciting thing about the curriculum. Really, you can engage, and I've seen it. I've been able to sit in some classes and watch this happen, and it's really, it's so uplifting. You can start with one experience or idea, and then that takes you on a journey, and you can see the young people just engaged with it in a way which I don't think probably I was when I was their age, really. But yes, you're right to say that there's a tension then, isn't there, between making sure there's a consistent approach across the system generally, but a very flexible approach at school level. I think we've got that balance right in terms of how we design the curriculum. There's obviously a framework, some aspects are mandatory, and we ask schools to work in clusters with each other. But that balance is one which we obviously need to keep an eye on throughout, really. One of the things I've been clear that I want to make sure is understood is that it's a curriculum for Wales. So it's not a curriculum for parts of Wales, it's a curriculum for Wales. So teachers are able to access resources from any other part of Wales as they design their curriculum. I think that's a really important part of it.
So there's a potential upcoming, of course, for some industrial action in schools and universities. That must be a very difficult process of thought for you as a Labour government and as a Labour MS. So how do you deal with potential industrial action in an area where you are responsible, and how do you reconcile that as a trade unionist?
Well, you start from the point that people. I've said this in my response to points which the teaching unions have raised with me directly. Our starting point as a government is that it's perfectly reasonable for teachers, teaching assistants, not to expect their wages to be devalued by inflation. That's the starting point. But in order to be able to meet the sort of claims which have come in, the sorts of funds, the sort of funding available to us doesn't begin to meet that level of claim, really. So we could not meet that kind of claim without additional funding from the UK government. But that isn't to say that I don't recognise it as being a perfectly reasonable ask. Obviously, as Education Minister, I don't want to see strikes in our schools and colleges. I know that the teachers making this decision, whether they'll vote for industrial action, will be obviously weighing that very carefully in the balance, won't they, obviously? But I also recognise the disappointment, and people have rights in the area of industrial action, so we absolutely recognise that as a government.
It would be strange of us not to touch somewhat on the many crazy goings on in Westminster at this time. Mm-hmm. What has been your response to that, just sort of personally and politically? And do you think that now it's almost certain that we will see a Labour government in the next election?
Yes, I think we will. And I think the country's crying out for it. And I've just been offended, if I'm honest, by the way in which the Conservative leadership elections have been, going on, and the kind of obvious machinations that have happened in Parliament around that. And it's all been, regarded as a piece of political theatre, and who's up and who's down, and who's backing who and who's not backing who. And that's, I think you've seen some MPs backing, two different candidates on the same day, for heaven's sake, which just shows a complete absence of principle and values, isn't it, really? But I'm sure all of us have been offended by seeing it play out in that way because of, the absolutely profound effects it's had on the lives of ordinary people across the UK. Grossly irresponsible actions by Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng in that budget has, imposed so many extra burdens on families in Wales and right across the UK. The interest rates compounding the cost of living crisis that was already there. And I just think they are living in a completely different world. And that's been exposed, I think, over the last few weeks.
What do you think the major challenges facing Keir Starmer then are as he approaches this election? And do you think they are the same challenges that the Welsh Labour government face, or do you think they're slightly different, one being in government, one being in opposition?
Well, I think the challenges are slightly different, aren't they? So no, I think he will make an excellent Prime Minister. I think that from a Welsh point of view, having a Welsh Labour government in Wales and a Labour government in Westminster is the best possible way for us to make sure that people of Wales have what they need and have support both at a devolved and a Westminster level that we need in this incredibly difficult time. So I'm very, very much looking forward to seeing that happen. We don't yet know when the general election will take place. I think the difficult challenges which an incoming Labour government will face is the parlous state of the UK economy, which the Conservative government will be handing on. We've got a strong set of commitments in terms of the cost of living response, the windfall tax. The sooner that is introduced, the better. But I think it'll be very difficult for an incoming Labour government facing the kind of mess which the Tory government will be bequeathing.
One of the other things we don't know, of course, is when Mark Drakeford will stand down as First Minister, and obviously he has said he'll probably go at some point this term. When you backed Mark in 2018, you said that the new First Minister wanted experience of handling Brexit negotiations and funding negotiations with the UK government, because they'll be the two most pressing issues we face. When there is a new First Minister, what do you think the qualities that person will need are, and what do you think the main challenges will be at that point?
Well, look, no one is in any rush at all for Mark to stand down. I think he has shown excellent leadership from the moment he was elected, and I think there'll be plenty of time probably to discuss at some future point the next chapter in the leadership of the party and the government. But I think what we've seen in Mark, it has been a blend of solidity and principle. And I think it's been a very difficult time to be First Minister, an incredible set of challenges, both from a COVID point of view and now going into, how we can respond to the cost of living challenges. And what you see in Mark is a man of principle, I think, trying to navigate very difficult circumstances. I think we've been very successful, haven't we, in government in terms of renewing ourselves in government. And I think there'll be plenty of time in future to talk about what happens next, I think. But I think Mark has been a very, very effective leader indeed and continues to be. And I look forward to him continuing to be our leader for some time yet.
Jeremy Miles, thank you so much for coming to talk to us this evening. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Diolch yn fawr.
And if you've enjoyed what you've heard this evening, please don't forget to find Hiraeth on social media, on Twitter and on Facebook at HiraethPod, or at our website, www.walespolitics.com. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.